of 1930, Raphael Pansardi and his wife Leonarda Cianciulli moved with their 4 young kids to a little town in northern Italy called Correggio. A terrible earthquake had destroyed the family's previous village and killed nearly all of their neighbors. And so this family was feeling very lucky to be alive, but when they arrived in Correggio, they really had nothing and were hoping that, the people of this town will just be very welcoming and generous and kind of help them get set up again. And the people of this town did exactly that. Correggio was this beautiful place inside of a fertile valley where people lived in these cottages surrounded by rice fields and mulberry trees. And the people who lived there were very tight-knit and looked after each other and cooked for each other and had parties together. I mean, this was a real community. And so when Raphael and Leonarda arrived, the townspeople immediately found them this cute little cottage by a stream with a whitewashed front door and a beautiful stone hearth for cooking. And there was an attached storefront on this cottage that they were giving them. And then on top of that, once the family had moved in, the family's new neighbors helped get Raphael a job, and they also helped Leonarda set up the attached storefront that was part of their cottage so she could sell her homemade soap bars out of this shop. And so very quickly, the family just completely fell in love with Correggio, especially 36-year-old Leonarda. Losing her home and her previous neighbors in that terrible earthquake had been a tragedy on epic scale, but it was far from the first tragedy that Leonarda had been forced to live through. Leonarda had been born into poverty. Her mother had actually come from a very wealthy family, but they had cut Leonarda's mom off when she became pregnant with Leonarda. And so when Leonarda's mom gave birth to her, she blamed Leonarda for their poverty and all of their problems, and so beat her relentlessly. And then on top of that, Leonarda's father died when she was very young, and so she was stuck at home being abused constantly by her mother. When Leonarda was 21, she met Raphael and fell in love with him, and he was a very kind and gentle man. He really made a very strong first impression on anyone who met him. But when Leonarda went to her mother and introduced Raphael to her and said, "I'm going to marry this man, I love him," her mother flew into a rage and then literally cursed Leonarda. She actually out loud muttered the spell and then told Leonarda that because of the spell, Leonarda would have evil following her forever. Now, of course, Leonarda was very used to her mother's terrible behavior, and so she did not actually think she was at risk of this curse affecting her life in any way. But not long after actually marrying Raphael, Leonarda began to see evidence that this curse might actually be real. It started with Leonarda having these sudden fits of seizures for no particular reason, and then Leonarda, every time she got pregnant, she would miscarry and lose the baby. And so feeling really sad and desperate because all she wanted was a family, Leonarda actually went to a fortune teller in hopes that they would tell her that in the future, her life got better, not worse, which to Leonarda meant, the curse was not real if my life improves. But after this fortune teller took Leonarda's hands and studied her palms, she looked up at Leonarda and gave her grave news. She said, "Leonarda, you're going to have living children, but they're all going to die young. And I see a prison and an insane asylum in your future." This experience totally shocked Leonarda and confirmed for her that her mother's curse must be real. And sure enough, over the following years, Leonarda and Raphael would go on to have 14 living children, and 10 of them would die when they were babies or toddlers. And so by the time Leonarda had arrived in Correggio with her family in 1930, she was absolutely petrified that her last 4 precious children would die because of this curse. And so in order to keep her kids safe, she basically never let them out of her sight, and then she also made sure they always adhered to these strange rules and beliefs that Leonarda had come up with about good and evil that were designed to somehow protect the kids from this curse. But But the incredible show of generosity and support and kindness that Leonarda and her family had experienced when they arrived in Correggio had really done something to Leonarda. In fact, it really kind of changed the way she viewed the world. Suddenly, she was less concerned with this curse and how to protect her family from it, and instead, she was just kind of content. She felt safe. She felt happy. The women in the town loved Leonarda and always came by the house to say hi to her and eat some of the amazing tea cakes that she would make. And also, Leonarda had become best friends with this woman named Virginia, who was a former opera singer from Milan, who was very elegant and beautiful. And every time she went to a dinner party, she would invite Leonarda. And also, Leonarda and her family were becoming financially stable really for the first time ever. Leonarda's soap shop that she ran out of their cottage was really successful. People came from all around to buy her soaps because nobody could make them like she could. And Raphael's job as a clerk was very steady, and he too was becoming well respected in town. And so because of how well this transition to Correggio had been, at some point Leonarda made a promise both to herself and to the universe that instead of focusing all of her time and energy on this curse, which had plagued her whole life, instead she was going to focus on helping the people of Correggio any way she could, because they had done so much for her. And that is exactly what Leonarda did, but in a kind of ironic way. Because of the fear Leonarda had for her mother's curse, she had gone to that fortune teller many years ago. And even though the news she got when she saw the fortune teller was horrible, Leonarda had left that experience kind of fascinated with the art of fortune telling and magic and sorcery. It just really appealed to her. And so now that Leonarda was running this very successful soap shop out of her house, there were all these people coming from far and wide that would ask to barter for her soaps. Bartering is like trading one item for another item versus paying for something outright with money. And so Leonarda began bartering with these travelers whenever they had books about fortune telling, about magic, about sorcery, about how to make potions, about the occult. And after reading through all of these books and learning as much as she could, Leonarda, in addition to selling her soaps, began offering fortune telling services to the people of Correggio. And it would turn out she was really good at predicting the future, to the point where people in town basically began going to her for all kinds of advice. She helped women find love, she told farmers what crops to plant, she created these charm bags for people and told them they would protect them. She also began creating these herb potions for people when they got sick. It actually got to the point where people trusted her so much that when they got sick, they didn't even go to the doctor. They just went to her. And so very quickly, Leonarda felt very proud of the fact that she had lived up to the promise she had made both to herself and to the universe to always help the people of Correggio at every turn. But more than that, Leonarda was starting to think that this newfound sense of purpose and happiness she was getting in helping the people of Correggio through her various services had finally broken her mother's curse. By 1939, Leonarda and her family had been living in Correggio very happily for almost 10 years, and at the time, Leonarda's oldest son, Giuseppe, was 17 years old. Giuseppe was tall, he was handsome, he had dark hair, he had dark eyes, and all the girls loved him. And Giuseppe and Leonarda had always had a very close relationship. Every day, Giuseppe would come home, and he and his mom would sit in the kitchen, and they would chat for a while and eat some of her tea cakes. But now, in 1939, when Giuseppe was 17, he started to act a little bit different. He would come home, and instead of going into the kitchen to sit with Leonarda, he would just go straight to his room and shut the door. And when Leonarda or Raphael would ask him, hey, is everything okay? Giuseppe would get very defensive and say he was fine and to please just leave me alone. But to Leonarda, it seemed really obvious that her son was not fine, and she thought, maybe he has some sort of secret he's keeping, and that's what's making him act this way. He's hurting on the inside, but he can't share it with the world. But Leonarda had no idea what this secret might be. And then one day, late that same year, Leonardo was walking through town when one of her neighbors came up to her and said, "Hey, are you aware that your son Giuseppe has signed up for the military and he's leaving for training in just a few months?" Leonardo had not heard about this. People were talking a lot about World War II, which had just started around this time, but Leonardo had never considered that her precious son would go off to fight in that war. But now Leonardo realized that Giuseppe's recent strange behavior suddenly made sense. This was the secret he was keeping. He had joined the military and he hadn't told his family. Leonardo turned around and went straight home. She went right into her bedroom, shut the door, and she just sobbed. To her, it felt like her mother's curse was back, and now her precious son was going to go off into the war and he was going to die, unless she found a way to combat this evil that was now following her again. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Growing up, I was always encouraged to speak up if I was feeling down or sad, and so as a kid, talking about my feelings was really easy. But fast forward to 2017, when I was in my late 20s and suffering for the first time from a severe bout of depression, it was like I knew what I was supposed to do, ask for help, but I just couldn't do it. It was like I was afraid if I told someone what my issues were, it would scare them, or worse, it would make them feel bad too. Luckily, my wife and my family encouraged me to go seek out a therapist, and honestly, that totally changed my life. But the point I'm trying to make here is that because of my upbringing, I should have been the first person in line for therapy right when I started struggling in 2017. But that's just not how life works. Oftentimes, the way we think we will act during a crisis is very different from how we actually act during a real crisis. So if you are struggling right now with your own personal crisis and you're hiding it from other people, you haven't asked for help yet, stop, take a deep breath, and do what I did. Consider therapy. And one of the easiest entry points into therapy is BetterHelp, because it's a world-class therapy service that is 100% online, which means you don't have to physically go into a doctor's office and awkwardly wait for your big first meeting with a therapist. Instead, you can get the help you need from the comfort of your home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a quick survey, and then you can choose how you want to communicate with your therapist, whether that's through chat or text or phone call or video call or some combination of all of them. Also, you can switch your therapist at any time for free. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallen. I've also linked them in the description below. Okay, back to the story. For the next several days, Leonardo did not open up her soap shop, she didn't come downstairs, she just stayed locked in her bedroom and read through all of her books about magic and sorcery and the occult, looking for some sort of solution for how to fight this curse. And finally, she figured out what she had to do. She read that if she gave something beautiful to the universe would reward her. And in Leonardo's mind, that reward would be sparing her son. And so Leonardo decided that the most beautiful thing she could offer the universe would be to help the people of Correggio, which she was already doing, but in her mind, she thought she could really ramp up her efforts and really try to change people's lives. And she thought if she could do that, the universe was sure to notice and it would save her son's life. Leonardo decided that the first person she would really go above and beyond to help inside of Correggio was a woman named Faustina. Faustina, who was in her 70s, was desperate to get married, but to many people in town, including Leonardo, she seemed kind of beyond help. She was totally antisocial, she was awkward, and just kind of given her age, it seemed like marriage was just not in the cards for her. But this is where Leonardo thought she could step in and change everything for Faustina. She would find her a husband. So Leonardo reached out to Faustina and told her about a friend of hers, a man who lived in a city to the north, who was also alone in his old age and who was likely looking for marriage, and she could set them up if Faustina was interested. And so Faustina was immediately interested and wanted to meet this guy, but Leonardo did tell her that, this guy, the reason he's not married is He's kind of difficult to be around. He's kind of a jerk, but he's got a wonderful heart. He means well. I think he'd be a great fit for you. And so again, Faustina's like, great, I want to meet him. I want to marry him. I'm ready. And then finally, the day came when Faustina actually went to this other town and met this guy in person, and they fell in love. And Faustina just moved right in with him. And before long, she was sending happy postcards back to Correggio, telling everyone about how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonardo's help in setting them up. And so Leonardo was obviously thrilled, not only for her friend's happiness, but also it really felt like she had checked the box in terms of really going above and beyond to help someone in Correggio in an effort to get the universe to spare her son. But her son was still a couple months away from leaving for training, and Leonardo, she's very superstitious, and she's thinking, okay, I don't know if that was enough to get the universe to save my son, and so I need to find somebody else I can help. So, in September of 1940, Leonardo began her next good deed project with another woman in town. She was a widow in her 50s named Francesca. She had worked as a teacher, but when her husband got sick, she quit her job, and then when her husband ultimately died, she was left with nothing. So Leonardo reached out to Francesca and told her that she, Leonardo, would be willing to reach out to her own mother's rich family to see if maybe they had a job they could finesse for Francesca. Now, of course, Leonardo was not excited about talking to her mother's family, who had disowned her mother and had shown no interest in Leonardo, but Leonardo wanted to do this for Francesca and for the sake of her son and getting the universe to notice what she was doing. And so sure enough, Leonardo would reach out to her mother's family, and they were remarkably open to the idea, and they got a job for Francesca in Switzerland. And so eventually, Francesca jetted off to Switzerland, and then a couple of days later, she was sending postcards back to Correggio saying how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonardo's help. And so again, Leonardo was so happy about this outcome, both because she cared about Francesca and also because this was yet another kind of check in the box of her good deeds that the universe was going to notice that in turn would save her son. But again, after Francesca didn't need any more help, Leonardo found herself looking at her son, who was getting closer and closer to leaving for training, and she would think to herself, have I done enough to protect him? Have I really stopped this curse from killing him after he leaves? And Leonardo eventually decided that no, she had not done enough. She needed to do at least one more really big good deed for someone in this town. And who better to help than her best friend, Virginia, the former opera singer. Leonardo knew from all her talks with Virginia that Virginia really missed living in the big city and going to the opera house. And so Leonardo reached out to Virginia and said, you know what? I can reach out to my mother's rich family and maybe they can find a job for you in a big city if you're interested. And so Virginia was like, wow, yes, I would love that. That's an amazing opportunity. And so Leonardo again would contact her mother's rich family, and again they came through, finding this job as a social planner for this very rich guy in Florence, Italy, who often funded plays and operas. And so this job was perfect for Virginia. When Leonardo told Virginia about this opportunity, Virginia cried tears of joy. After packing up all of her things, Virginia made a stop at Leonardo's house to say goodbye and thank you, and the two women would hug and laugh and cry, they would drink wine together, and then finally, when it was time for Virginia to go, even though Leonardo was very sad, she was also quite happy, because finally she felt like this good deed was enough to get the universe to spare her son. However, Leonardo, being a very superstitious person, did have one more little thing she wanted to do with Giuseppe before he left for the military. And this little thing was her, Leonardo, bathing her son, her 18-year-old son, with a particular bar of soap, and then she also wanted to feed him a special kind of tea cake that she was going to make. The soap and the tea cake had these special herbs and ingredients and different things she had pulled from her books of magic and the occult, and they would kind of form like a protective barrier both outside and inside of Giuseppe. So, on the same night that Virginia headed off to Florence, when Giuseppe came home, Leonardo approached him and said, I want to give you this bath and I want to feed you these tea cakes. And Giuseppe was not remotely enthused at the idea of having his mom bathe him. He's 18. But he knew she was highly superstitious, she seemed pretty emotional about this, and it just seemed like it was extremely important to her. And so he said, okay. And so Leonardo washed her son with this special kind of magic soap, and then she also gave him the tea cakes. And then afterward, even though Giuseppe was really annoyed by what he had just been asked to do, Leonardo was so happy she was practically floating. She felt like she had done everything she could possibly do, and now she could just relax because her son was safe. But soon, Leonardo would learn that that was not actually true. A few days after giving her son the magical last bath and magical tea cakes, the police showed up at the front door of Leonardo's house. And when she opened the door and saw the police, she asked what was going on, and the police would say to her, hey, the 3 women that you supposedly helped that left town recently, they've all been reported missing by their families. They don't know where they are. And so Leonardo, she was totally shocked by this, and she said, no, that's not possible. I write to them all the time. I get postcards that come in very regularly from all of them. And then Leonardo went and got the postcards and showed the police, like, look, I'm talking to them. How could they possibly be missing? And so the police, they would look at these letters and they would agree with Leonardo that it is pretty strange that she'd be getting these very authentic seeming letters from these women if these women were also missing. And so eventually the police would leave and they would tell Leonardo that they would be in touch if they needed anything. And then over the next couple of days, Leonardo was very concerned about these 3 women, but she received numerous postcards from these women over those several days, and all of these postcards were totally normal seeming. And so Leonardo was fairly confident that whatever was going on with the police had to have been a mix-up, and she wouldn't be hearing from them again. But a couple of weeks later, the police did come back to Leonardo's house, except this time they didn't knock, they just barged right in. After the police had spoken with Leonardo that first time, they did some digging on these letters that she was receiving, and they managed to trace them all back to their start point. And it turned out all of these letters from all 3 of these women were originating from one place. It was this little town to the north of Correggio. And when police went to this little town, they discovered that these letters that were starting in this little town were all being mailed by the same person. And they got a physical description of this person who apparently was pretending to be these 3 women. And the description was of a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and dark eyes. It was Giuseppe. After the police barged into Leonardo's house, they went straight to Giuseppe's room where they accused him of murdering those 3 women, and then they hauled him out of the house and brought him to the station to question him about where he dumped the bodies. When the last police officer left Leonardo's house, Leonardo walked outside and just stood there wondering what she was going to do. It was like she had done everything in her power to protect her son from this curse, but somehow this curse she knew had done this to her son. And so now she knew there was only one thing she could do. Without saying anything to her husband, she went inside, she got her things, and she began making her way to the police station. At this point in her life, Leonardo looked much older than her actual age of 46. She had very gray hair, her face was very wrinkled, and she was stooped over, and she was always carrying these charm bags and magical potions and little stick figures that she claimed protected her family. And so her overall appearance when she wandered into the police station was that of a very frail old woman who was also very strange. And so Leonardo hobbled her way up to the front desk, and in a trembling voice, she asked the attendant if she could speak to the detective who was working on her son's case. And then a moment later, she was led into an interview room where she was told to wait. And then a little while later, the lead detective walked into the room. He sat down across the table from Leonardo and he said, "What can I do for you?" And immediately Leonardo said, "My son, Giuseppe, is innocent." And the detective, when he heard this, he was not remotely surprised. In fact, this is fully what he expected this conversation was going to be. He knew Leonardo loved her son very much, and of course she was going to say he was innocent. This is what parents typically did in cases like this. But the detective decided he wouldn't try to stop her. He would just let this very distraught mother kind of talk for a bit. He would tell her that he would follow up on whatever she was saying, and then he would drive her back home. But this detective was not expecting the things that would come out of Leonarda's mouth over the next couple of hours. In fact, her story about why Giuseppe was innocent was so shocking and so bizarre that the detective outright said, "I don't believe you. I don't believe this. This can't be true." And then other officers were called in to listen to her story to see if they believed it. And they too said, "This doesn't seem real." But the police would follow up on the details she gave, and it all checked out. It would turn out, back in late 1939, on the day that Faustina, the first woman that Leonarda pledged to help in order to get the universe to save her son, when Faustina was set to go north and meet her future husband, Faustina stopped by Leonarda's house to say bye. And when she was in Leonarda's house, something very unexpected happened. When Faustina walked into Leonarda's kitchen where Leonarda was, Faustina was so excited about meeting her potential future husband that her hands were shaking and she was smiling ear to ear. And so Leonarda said to Faustina, "Hey, you need to calm down." And so she handed Faustina a glass of wine. And so Faustina took the wine and she had a couple of sips of wine. And right away, Faustina started feeling dizzy. And before long, she was grabbing the table just to keep from falling over. It would turn out the wine was poisoned by Leonarda. And so Faustina, she's kind of looking up at Leonarda. And Leonarda is looking down at her. And she's got an axe in one of her hands. And she says to Faustina, "I'm so sorry." And then she winds up and she strikes Faustina in the chest with the axe and lodges it in her chest. And so she lets go of it, expecting Faustina to die. She doesn't. Faustina's just standing there with an axe in her chest. And so Leonarda grabbed the handle of the axe, she pulled it out of her chest, and then began wailing on her head over and over and over again until Faustina did fall to the ground dead. Then Leonarda lit a fire under her big metal pot on the stove, and then she cut Faustina's body into 9 pieces. She drained the blood out of the body into a bucket, and then she chucked those 9 pieces into the pot on the stove and began to mix them with caustic soda, which is a powerful dissolving agent that's used to make soap. And then she boiled the ingredients, her body parts and this caustic soda, for hours. Faustina's body slowly turned into this horrible black mush inside of this pot, and Leonarda was watching this the whole time, and she just had a look of total disappointment as this was happening. And then at some point, she just took the pot off the stove and dumped the ingredients, Faustina's body, down the septic tank. And then Leonarda waited for Faustina's blood that she had dumped out to coagulate, which means it became semi-solid. And then she heated it up in the oven and then ground it into flour. And she would use that flour to make tea cakes, which she fed to her friends the next day, as well as her son, Giuseppe. Leonarda also asked her son to mail some letters for her from the little town to the north where Faustina had supposedly gone. These letters, of course, were written by Leonarda, pretending to be Faustina to give the impression that she was still alive and well. And Giuseppe, when he was told to go mail these letters, didn't think anything of it. He was used to doing errands for his mom. Even though Leonarda basically got away with killing Faustina, her plan for Faustina had not really gone the way Leonarda had hoped. When she boiled Faustina's chopped up body parts and this caustic soda, they didn't really mix the way she wanted them to. Leonarda was convinced that the reason for this is because Faustina was too skinny, and so there wasn't enough fat on her body for the mix to be perfect. So Leonarda had come up with another elaborate story, this time for another woman, Francesca, about that job in Switzerland she got through her mother's rich family. Of course, none of that was true, and when Francesca came by Leonarda's house to say goodbye to her, she was offered a glass of poisoned wine, and after she sipped from it, she became dizzy, and then Leonarda showed up with an axe and hacked Francesca to death. But again, when the body parts and the caustic soda were in the pot on the stove boiling together, they were still not coming together the way Leonarda wanted. And so again, Leonarda, with a look of disgust, just dumped the pot down the septic tank and wound up making tea cakes from Francesca's blood. Then the next day, she fed those tea cakes to her friends, as well as Giuseppe, and she also asked Giuseppe to send a few more letters from up north. These letters were, of course, from Francesca. Still feeling totally unsatisfied with how the last 2 killings had gone, Leonarda moved on to her third target, her best friend, Virginia. And this time, when Virginia came by Leonardo's house to say goodbye, everything went to plan. Leonardo was able to poison Virginia, she killed her with the axe, she chopped her up, she put her in the pot, and this time, the 9 chunks of her body mixed beautifully with the caustic soda. And so after adding a few fine perfumes into the pot, Leonardo was finally able to create the thing that she had not been able to create with the other 2 women's bodies. And that was a beautiful, rich, creamy bar of soap. She also, again, made tea cakes from Virginia's blood. That night, when Giuseppe came home, Leonardo demanded that she be allowed to bathe him with her magic soap, i.e. the soap made from Virginia's body. And so she did that. She scrubbed him with Virginia's body soap. And then while she was doing that, she fed him the tea cakes that were made from Virginia's blood. It would turn out Leonardo did in fact believe that in order to save her son from this curse, she would need to give something beautiful to the universe. And at first, she really had believed that the way to do that was by helping the people of Correggio above and beyond anything she had ever done before. But at some point during her interactions with Faustina, the first woman, Leonardo had decided that, you know what, that wasn't enough. She really needed to make sure that her son was going to be safe. And so the only way really that Leonardo could guarantee her son would be safe would be if she actually took a life and gave that back to the universe. That would save her son. The reason Leonardo wound up taking 3 lives and not just 1 life is because she also decided that as an extra protective measure, she wanted to make sure that she actually bathed her son, literally, in the body parts and kind of essence of the life she had taken. And so that's where the idea of the soap came in. However, the first 2 women, their body parts didn't mix right, and so she couldn't turn them into soap. But then Virginia came along and her body did mix with the caustic soda, and so Leonardo was able to make her soap. She was able to bathe her son with Virginia's body and feed him Virginia's blood. And so in Leonardo's mind, she had done everything she could to protect her son at that point. Leonardo would ultimately be sentenced to 30 years in prison, as well as 3 years in an insane asylum, just as the fortune teller had predicted. Leonardo died in 1970 when she was 76 years old. As for her family, they fled Correggio, and 3 of her children changed their names and vanished. And her prized son, Giuseppe, who she had killed to protect, had gone on to join the military, and he would go to war, and he either was killed in combat or simply changed his name and vanished as well. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go in to the Like Button's sleeping playlist and change the 4th song to the loudest death metal music you can find. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we upload remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime, as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your... No matter whether you believe this tragedy is the result of something paranormal or something normal and rational and explainable, no matter which way you feel, or maybe somewhere in the middle, The details of the story itself, the actual facts of the story, are horrifying. What actually happened to this poor family in the 1920s it's just one of the more terrifying ordeals that I've ever come across, and it's crazy to me that it's a true story. Without giving too much away, someone or something shows up on this farm and it doesn't leave. One of the maids starts hearing strange sounds. They start looking for this person or this thing. They start seeing things moving around in their house, and there's every indication that someone is in the farm. Someone has snuck into the farm and is terrorizing us. And then on March 31st, 1922, whatever it was, finally attacks. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the dark, strange, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then my channel is the one for you. That is literally all I do on this channel, and I upload 3 to 4 times every week. So if that is of interest to you, I would ask you to gently 360 no-scope the like button, subscribe, and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Back in the 1920s, there was a farmstead called Hinterkaifeck Farm that was located in southern Germany in a very rural, isolated, heavily forested area. So the occupants of the farm were the live-in maid and the Gruber family. The Gruber family was Andreas, his wife Azelia, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, Josef and Azelia as well. And everything was going fine for the Gruber family and for their farm until the winter of 1921, when some very strange things started happening on their property. The first one to notice strange things happening around their property was their live-in maid. She spent the majority of her time in the main house, and she was alone a lot of the time. And she started to notice when she was alone that she would hear tapping, what sounded like in the walls. Not someone in another room tapping, but literally something in the walls. And she would go up and she would listen, and it would still be tapping, but she couldn't make sense of it. And then she started hearing a combination of disembodied voices and footsteps in the attic. And when she started hearing those footsteps and voices coming from the attic, she ran and told Andreas to say, hey, someone's in your attic. Andreas would go up. Even though he was skeptical, he'd go up to the attic and he would look, and not only is no one there, but it was this totally open space up there. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. There was no one up there, and there was no sign of anybody having been up there. There was no food. There was nothing. And so over the course of several weeks, the live-in maid kept saying that at night she'd be laying in bed and she would hear footsteps and voices from the attic. She'd hear tapping in the walls. She would tell Andreas, and then Andreas, he'd be frustrated with her because he didn't really believe her, and he'd go charging up into the attic and nothing would be there. And so she was just not having it. She'd been working with this family for a long time. She did not feel convinced that no one was there. She really thought this place was haunted. And so she ultimately tells the Gruber family, like, I'm sorry, but I can't stay here another night. Whenever I'm here, I feel like I'm being watched. And at night, I can't sleep because of the footsteps in the attic and these voices. I know you've checked, but I can't be here anymore. And so she quits. And it really catches the Gruber family by surprise because they rely on her help. And so they're kind of thrown for a loop because they have to replace her. And so she leaves, and now they need to go find a replacement. Over the following 6 months, they would not find a replacement, and it would create an increased workload for basically everybody on the farm, which led to a higher stress level. Everybody's kind of on edge. You know, the departure of the live-in maid was a really big deal. And so you got to put that in perspective as you hear what happens over the next 6 months. At first, after the live-in maid had left, no one reported hearing any strange sounds around the house. You know, they were so busy that they didn't even have time to consider if there was any sounds in the house that they didn't recognize. But eventually, Andreas would later admit that he started hearing the tapping sounds and the footsteps in the attic and the disembodied voices, and no one's there. And so now he's becoming paranoid, and he shared his paranoia with the rest of the family, who's now also hearing these sounds and these disembodied voices and the footsteps, and despite checking and now searching the whole property. Like, they've begun to actually do a full-blown investigation. Everyone's just stressed. They don't know what it's coming from. They're mad at each other for becoming paranoid. And so they just continue on with work and try to put it out of their mind that they're hearing these strange sounds. But the activity in the house would only intensify. what was initially just strange tapping sounds and what they thought were disembodied voices turned into things going missing around the house. Most notably, a set of their house keys went missing. And there's only so many people there. There's really not a good answer as to why they might go missing, and they only have a couple sets. It's a big deal to lose a set of keys, and they went missing and they couldn't find them. Once the keys went missing, the family couldn't stop thinking about the strange sounds in their house and wondering if there really was someone hiding in their house. And it was terrifying. And then when young Azalea, one of the grandchildren, suddenly went missing one night, the whole family is in full panic. They go out looking everywhere for her. They're yelling in the forest. They can't find her. And then finally they find her, and she has no idea how she got out, where she went, and what even happened. She just was like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know how I got out. She was exhausted. She was confused. They brought her back to the house, and they're trying to get her to explain why you were doing that. She can't. They go back inside, and sitting on the table is a newspaper that Andreas didn't subscribe to. No one in the family had brought. No one even in the area, it would turn out, subscribed to this particular kind of obscure newspaper, and it's just sitting in their house. A couple days after that, they noticed that someone had clearly tried to break into their tool shed, which had loads of tools in there, very expensive. There was a lock on the outside, and there was very deep gashes into the metal. It looked like someone had been, hacking away at the lock to try to break it open. But, they're living in a very isolated part of Germany where there isn't much ambient sound. And so it was strange to them that someone had been so violent with this lock, like hacking at this metal lock, presumably with something metal, and no one had heard it or reacted to it. None of the dogs had heard it, nothing. So just very confusing stuff is starting to happen around the property. But it would be what Andreas sees in the spring of 1922 that pushes he and his family over the edge from general paranoia to outright panic. So Andreas wakes up in early March of 1922. There was this huge snowstorm the night before. He gets up early and he goes to the back door of his house and he opens it up, and he can clearly see that there are footprints that have walked from the forest, which is pretty far away from his property. They have quite a bit of acreage. There's footsteps that are clearly coming out of the forest all the way up to the door that he has now just opened. And he's looking down at these footprints, and there's no return set of tracks. And so he's thinking to himself, well, whoever walked up to my house came into the house. So he shuts the door and locks it and immediately goes and wakes up his family and says, hey, why are there footprints leading up to the back door? Because there's no footprints going away. Someone came to the back door and apparently came inside. His wife, his daughter, the grandkids, no one has a clue. The maid, nobody knows. They say, hey, we've been asleep. We have no idea. So now Andreas, he's obviously thinking about the strangeness that's happened in his house over the past couple of months. And so he's worried. So he opens the door back up and he looks and he's studying these footprints and he's like, I just don't get it. You have to turn around and walk back. Otherwise you're here. You're at the house. He shuts the door and he walks around his house. He looks at all of the different exits to his house. So he looks to see if there's exiting footprints, which it's scaring him thinking about it, which means someone would have come into the house and jumped out a window or gone out another door, but he's just checking. And as soon as he makes sure there's no other footprints, he does a scan of his entire house. Because now he's convinced that someone's in his house. He goes to the attic. He goes all around. He's yelling. He's looking everywhere. There's nothing. There's no one in the house. The family's concerned, but there's no one in the house. So he keeps everything locked. And he goes outside and he starts tracking these footprints back to where they came from. And he walks all the way to the forest, and they just kind of stop abruptly. Like they just started kind of magically at the edge of the tree line and walked right up to his house, but there's no clear origination besides it's just in the forest somewhere. And there's also no clear sense of what happened once they arrived at the door. So after doing one more loop around his property, he goes in the barn, he goes in the shed, he goes back in his house, he's checking the attic, he's looking everywhere, and he can't find any indication that some stranger is here. He finally decides that he's going to tell someone about what's been happening at his property. And so they did have a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who was his closest neighbor, who was not really that close, but a couple hundred yards away. And he goes over and he tells Lorenz everything. I've been hearing sounds. My maid quit because she was hearing sounds. We looked in the attic. We couldn't find anything. Then we started hearing sounds. The keys go missing. There's this newspaper in my house. My granddaughter's running out in the middle of the night. She's disappearing. She doesn't know what's going on. These footprints. I can't make sense of it. And so Lorenz, also not knowing what to make of it, suggests hey, I have extra weapons. You want to take an extra rifle and arm yourself, protect yourself. And Andreas just says, you know what? No, I'm good. I'm going to pass on the rifle. I'm probably overreacting anyways, and I'm sure we're just fine. But it would turn out he was not just fine, and he probably should have taken up Lorenz on the offer. So just a couple of days after speaking with his neighbor about the weirdness happening on his property, the Gruber family got a little bit of good news, which was they finally were able to locate another maid, a live-in maid, to come stay with them to replace the one who had left because she believed the place was haunted. And so a few weeks later, on March 31st, 1922, this new maid shows up to Hinterkaifeck. But unfortunately, this would also be the same date a horrible tragedy unfolds at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Over the course of 24 hours, someone or something was in the barn on Hinterkaifeck and was able to silently lure in members of the Gruber family one by one. Without telling anybody else what they were doing, they would walk over almost like in a trance into the barn where they would be struck in the head by something called a mattock, which is kind of like an axe. Blow to the head and they're down. As soon as they're down, whoever was in there, whatever was in there, would take their bodies and move them to the corner and lay them down, kind of square them up against the corner of the barn, and then cover them with hay. And then as soon as they were deceased, he would go, whatever it was, would go back and lure in the next person. So over a whole day, each of these members of the family are being lured into this barn where investigators, nobody knows what it was that was luring them in. They weren't scared when they went in. Their guard was down, and they would go in and then get hit in the head with this mattock until there was 4 people stacked up in the corner. And at that point, the remaining 2 people on the farm were still in the house sleeping, and whoever was doing this went into the house and used the mattock to end their lives as well. 4 days later, on April 4th, a repairman who was scheduled to come to the Hinterkaifeck farm shows up to repair the feeding machine. He goes to the door, he knocks on the door, and it's locked, and he can see lights on inside, he can hear the dog barking inside, but no one comes to greet him. Now, the feeder was outside of the main house, and it was actually on basically a public area of the farm, so he didn't need them to physically get to the feeder, and he knew how to fix it. So after trying the front door, going to the back door, looking in the windows and seeing lights, hearing the dog, but everything's locked, he just said, you know what, I'm just gonna do the job. So he goes into the area where the feeder is, he does the repair, and as he's leaving, he notices that the dog that was barking, that was inside the house, is now outside the house tied up. And so he goes over to that section of the house thinking, oh, well, now I'll knock on the door and someone's sure to see me. And again, no one comes to the door, and the back door that clearly must have just been opened to let the dog out, is locked again. And so he's like, man, that's odd. And so instead of just leaving, he finishes the job with the feeder, and he goes over to Lorenz Schlittenbauer's house, the neighbor, and he says, hey, just so you know, I was just over at the Gruber family's farm. I fixed their feeder like they wanted me to, but no one was there, but maybe somebody was there because the dog was inside, then it was outside. Don't know what's going on, but can you just let them know that I was here because I couldn't get in touch with them. But it prompts Schlittenbauer to go check on the Grubers because they haven't seen him in a couple days anyways, and so they figure they'll swing by and just make sure everything's okay. So they go over to Hinterkaifeck, and the lights are on in the house, the dog sure enough is outside, the doors are locked, and they see that the barn is actually open. So they go over to the barn, and in the barn, at first they don't see anything, but in the back corner underneath some hay are 4 of the bodies of the Gruber family. They go inside and they find the remaining 2 bodies, and no one else is there. Although there was signs of someone recently eating in the kitchen. The fire was lit, it was like the house was being lived in at that very moment. Although to Schlittenbauer and anybody that was there, they have no way of knowing that it's been days since the Gruber family had passed away. And so they end up leaving and getting in touch with authorities. So the police show up and they're able to determine with relative certainty that the tragedy took place on March 31st. But for 4 days afterwards, someone lived in the Gruber house, slept in their beds, ate their food, lit fires, lounged around inside, they played with the dog, they milked the cows. I mean, they lived in this house. They ran the farm for 4 days. And other neighbors would even say that, yeah, we saw smoke coming out of the chimney on, April 3rd and April 2nd. And so it was confirmed that someone had been staying in this house, which is so creepy. And so the police are a little bit baffled, and they're like, okay, well then it was probably a drifter. target of opportunity. They probably saw this isolated farm and they probably were going to rob them, stay there a little bit and then leave. But when they searched the farmhouse, there were large sums of cash that were just out practically in the open, like barely hidden, that had not been taken. And anybody that was robbing the place would have taken the cash. And so probably wasn't a robbery, which leaves maybe a crime of passion. But they were like, what's the motive? And unfortunately, Andreas was not particularly well liked in the town that was nearby. And so there was lots of people that didn't like Andreas, which made it really hard to whittle it down. So they started just interviewing like crazy. They're talking to hundreds of people that were in connection with, that could be connected to this, but they're getting nowhere. They did feel like Lorenz Schlittenbauer was probably the best suspect, because he's right there, he's right next door, he's their neighbor. And in fact, he had wanted to marry Victoria, the daughter, and Andreas had told him outright no, and they thought that could be a reason. But like the big issue with Lorenz Schlittenbauer being the primary suspect is, he had a farm to keep and a family to take care of. And so how could he have committed this crime and then ran the Hinterkaifeck farm for 4 days and lived there and slept there without his family knowing? And his family's like, no, he's been here with us. And so the police, they aren't able to solve it. They don't really have any decent suspects. And so they kind of leave it with, well, whoever did this probably had been there for about 6 months, potentially, before they committed the crime, and then stayed there for a few days afterwards and then vanished. And to this day, they have not been caught. And they even reopened this case in 2007. But they found that, despite the number of suspects and despite the evidence available, it just wasn't enough to provide any sort of clarity on what actually happened. So it remains a huge mystery. So like any other high-profile unsolved mystery, there are literally hundreds of potential explanations for what could have happened. But what I'm most interested in is what you all think could have happened. I will do my best to look through your comments, and I'll respond to the ones that are the most interesting or the most plausible. So please, if you would, in the comment section, let me know what you think happened at Hinterkaifeck. And if you haven't already, please gently 360 no scope the like button, and then please also subscribe and turn on all notifications so you get more content just like this in the days to follow. That's gonna do it, guys. I hope this was interesting. If you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out to me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. And I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen there as well. And that's gonna do it, guys, and I will talk to you soon. 2016, a woman living in Chicago, Illinois named Jordan Baranskis opened her eyes and realized she had fallen asleep on the couch the night before. She looked up and the TV was still on, and then she looked down at the other section of the couch and her boyfriend Matt was also asleep on the couch. As much as she wanted to keep sleeping alongside her boyfriend, she had work that day, so she stood up, turned the TV off, and made her way upstairs to get ready. As soon as she got upstairs, the first thing she did is go into her bedroom and get her purse that she left on the foot of her bed. But when she got in the room, her purse wasn't there. So she leaves her bedroom and she starts searching all the rooms upstairs, and she can't find her purse. And she's thinking to herself, I'm certain I had it the night before. I remember rifling through my purse before going downstairs and starting to fold laundry before ultimately falling asleep on the couch. So after spending about 15 minutes looking for the purse unsuccessfully, and now she's starting to stress because she's going to be late for work because she can't find her purse, she goes downstairs and she wakes Matt up and says, hey, I gotta find my purse. I thought I left it upstairs. Apparently I didn't. Can you help me look for it? Matt rolls over. He doesn't really want to get up because he's pretty tired and he doesn't have work, so he doesn't want to wake up right now. And he says, well, are you sure you didn't leave it at the restaurant last night? I mean, if you already looked, it's probably not here. You want to just give him a call and see if you left it there? Jordan was immediately really annoyed by his reaction because she just wanted him to stand up and help her look for the purse because she had work and he could just go back to sleep. And so it started this argument between the two of them where Matt just wanted her to call the restaurant because he was convinced she had it there. And Jordan was like, no, I know I had my purse. I'm positive I had it last night before I fell asleep on the couch with you. So their argument begins to escalate a little bit, and that's when Jordan remembers that they had recently installed a Nest camera downstairs to monitor their dogs whenever they were gone. And she thought, we can just look at the footage on the Nest camera, we can see me walking into the apartment, and I will either have or not have my purse in my hand. And so Jordan opens up her app and she calls Matt over, and they go back to the night before, right before they left for the restaurant. She's got her purse in hand, they leave the front door, and then several hours go by and they come back in, and very clearly Jordan has her purse in her hand. And Jordan turns to Matt and says, "Told you so." And Matt's like, "Okay, fine, let me help you look." And as they're about to put the app down, she realizes on the Nest camera timeline that motion was detected at 3:30 in the morning when they were both clearly asleep on the couch. And so she calls Matt back over and says, "Here, look, there's motion detected at 3:30 in the morning." And they hit play. After the couple had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on, a hooded figure emerges from their upstairs hallway and stands at the top of the stairs and just watches the two of them sleep. Before he left, he stole her purse along with a couple of other things from their apartment. And somehow this guy has never been caught, and he's been given the nickname Creeper Ghost. Edna Centrone was born on October 10th, 1954 in Puerto Rico, and she was brought to New York by her mother when she was about 5 years old. Edna's family had no money. Her mother, who supported her, was a clerical worker at the New York City Board of Education, where she would bring 2 boiled eggs to work every day so that she wouldn't have to pay for lunch. Edna's family lived in Lower Manhattan on Delancey Street, a neighborhood that was famous for waves of ethnic immigration. Edna had a tough childhood, but she would say she was loved and had enough. In 1987, Edna would meet her future husband, William. William had been visiting his brother at his brother's girlfriend's house in Upper Manhattan. When William walked into the kitchen, Edna was sitting there, and he was so struck with her beauty, he immediately left the room, found his brother, and said, "Who is that woman sitting in the kitchen?" And his brother would tell him that that was Edna. William went right back into the kitchen, and the two of them hit it off right away, and almost immediately they were dating. Every morning, William would leave his Brooklyn apartment and drive all the way to the north end of Manhattan. He would pick up Edna and then drive her to Midtown where she worked. And then he would fight traffic to go to his job. So it was just this horrible, horrible morning commute. But he loved Edna so much, he had no problem in the world doing it. Any chance he got to be around Edna, he was happy. A couple of months after they met, Edna would move in with William in his apartment in Brooklyn, and then 2 years later, they would get married. They discovered that Edna was not able to have kids of her own, and so they talked about adopting, and they were really excited about it, but they kept pushing it off for financial reasons. Like a lot of other couples in their neighborhood, they both had to work multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. Edna worked Monday through Friday as an administrative assistant for Marsh & McLennan, which was a large insurance broker located in the World Trade Center. William was a doorman in an apartment building on the swanky Upper East Side. Monday through Friday, after he was done working as a doorman at about 3 p.m., he would go to Harlem, where he and Edna owned a small flower shop, and he would work there until 8 p.m. at night. And then over the weekends, he and Edna would work at the flower shop. For fun, they liked to drive north to Bear Mountain State Park, where they would meet up with friends and relatives for barbecues and cookouts. And anytime they had a little bit of extra money, they loved going to Atlantic City and spending a little bit of cash on the slots and then taking advantage of the free food that came with gambling. But more than anything else, William and Edna got the most enjoyment out of each other. They were madly in love and inseparable for all 14 years they were together. That even on their worst days, when they came home and things just weren't right, they would always sit down together and they would eat their favorite ice cream and watch their favorite TV show together. On September 11th, 2001, William dropped Edna off at the World Trade Center where she worked. She made her way up to the 93rd floor of the North Tower where Marsh & McLennan was. She took her seat at her desk and began the day like any other day. At 8:46 a.m. that morning, a plane that had been hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists intentionally flew into the North Tower, crashing into floors 93 through 99. Everyone on board the plane and hundreds of people inside the towers where it was struck were killed instantly. Edna survived the initial crash, but she, like everybody else who was at floor 92 and up inside the North Tower on 9/11, were all trapped. Shortly after the crash, a cameraman on the ground was filming the impact site on the side of the World Trade Center, and they inadvertently captured Edna Centrone coming to the edge, clutching onto a metal girder, and she appears to be waving as if she's hoping someone is going to come up here and save her. But of course, there was no way to get to her, and she, like so many others that were trapped inside of the Twin Towers, had to make the terrible choice of waiting for the fire to consume me or jumping out this window. We don't know what her final choice was. However, we do know she was one of the 2,976 people who lost their life during that terrorist attack. On September 22nd, 2006, 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle. Cassie was very responsible, and so her aunt and uncle didn't just trust her to house-sit, they also regularly asked her to babysit their son. During this particular house-sitting weekend, Casey had invited her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, over to the residence to watch a movie with her. She had also invited two other friends named Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, who were classmates of her and Matt's. And so while the four teens are watching this movie, Brian and Tori kind of awkwardly stand up and announce to the other two that they don't want to watch a movie on the TV, they want to go watch a movie in the movie theater, and they promptly leave. Cassie and Matt thought it was a little bit odd that they would come over here specifically to watch a movie with them, only to say, we don't want to watch a movie with you guys, we want to watch it in the theater, but they didn't think much of it and they stayed to finish the movie. Unbeknownst to Cassie and Matt, when Brian and Tori left, they actually looped around to the back of the residence and unlocked the basement door so they could quietly re-enter later. Because these boys had been planning to do something absolutely horrible to Cassie, and they planned on doing it that night. Brian and Tori idolized serial killers. When Brian and Tori happened to watch the movie Scream together, which is a popular horror movie where this masked villain sneaks into teenagers' homes and terrorizes them, they decided that that would be the way they gained infamy. They would reenact the murder scenes from the movie Scream, but in real life. Shortly after this revelation, they begin filming themselves as they come up with their big plan of how they're going to break into someone's home and what they're going to do to them. And at some point on camera, they would say that they've identified their first victim, and it's going to be Cassie Jo Stoddart. They just needed to wait for a time when she was going to be alone. And when they found out she was going to be house sitting over that weekend in September for her aunt and uncle, they put their plan into motion. But when they showed up and Matt Beckham was there, Cassie's boyfriend, it kind of screwed up their plan. And so that's why Brian and Tori had stood up and said they were going to go watch a movie at the movie theater, because what they really wanted to do was come back later when Matt wasn't there anymore so they could attack Cassie. So Brian and Tori leave, and they do go to the movie theater, and they do buy tickets because they figure this is a great opportunity to create a solid alibi for themselves. But they don't stick around for the movie. They get back in their car, and they drive around and film themselves excitedly talking about how great it's going to be when Cassie's all alone and they can attack her. After a couple of hours of driving around, they can't wait any longer, and they figure that Matt must be gone by now. They park at the end of the street, they get out, they put on their masks and their gloves, and they sneak around to the side of the house where there was that open door that Brian had left. They open it up and then go inside of the residence where Cassie was, and they can hear upstairs that Matt is still there. Brian and Tori at this point felt so committed that they just said, you know what, we're gonna have to kill Matt too. So straight out of a horror movie, Brian and Tori hide in the basement wearing their mask and their gloves, they've got their knives, and they start making all this noise to try to get Cassie and Matt to come downstairs to see what's making all the sound. But it doesn't work. They don't come downstairs. So the next thing they do is they go to the circuit breakers and they cut the power to the house, hoping that Matt and Cassie will come downstairs to try to turn it back on. But again, Matt and Cassie stay upstairs. And so Brian and Tori turn the power back on and just continue to make sounds in the basement in hopes that Matt or Cassie, or hopefully both, would come downstairs so they could live out this fantasy. Meanwhile, upstairs, Matt and Cassie hadn't heard any of the sounds going on in the basement, but when the power went out, Cassie got really frightened and she asked Matt would he please stay with her overnight, and so Matt calls his mom and asks if that would be okay, and she says no, but you can invite Cassie over to our house and she can stay with us, and then tomorrow morning I'd be happy to drive her back to her aunt and uncle's house. But at the time the offer was made, the lights had come back on and Cassie had kind of calmed down and said, you know what, Matt, I'm actually just fine. I'm gonna stay here. At approximately 10:30 p.m. that night, Brian and Tori could hear Matt's mom showing up, picking him up and taking him home. And they were fairly certain that Cassie was alone, but they were gonna wait for a couple minutes to make sure she really was. As they were waiting, Matt actually called Tori and said, hey, I just left Cassie's house, can I come meet up with you guys? And Matt would later tell police that he couldn't really understand what Tori was saying. It was like he was whispering. And so Matt assumed that he must still be in the movie theater watching the movie, and Matt kind of gave up on the idea of meeting up with them and ultimately just hung up. And so after Tori got off the phone with Matt, he turned to Brian and said, she's alone. Matt just said so. Brian and Tori turned the power off once again and then walked up the stairs and slammed a closet door in hopes that it would entice her to come into the basement. But it didn't work because Cassie was horrified. She heard the slamming door. The lights are out and she's all alone, and so she's huddled up on the couch, terrified. So Brian and Tori, frustrated they can't live out their fantasy exactly the way they wanted to by attacking her in the basement, so they go upstairs, walk into the living room where Cassie is huddled on the couch, fearing for her life, and they proceed to stab their friend to death. After the murder, Brian and Tori ran from the house, got in their car, and the first thing they did is they fired up their video camera and they filmed their excited reaction to ending Cassie's life. Brian and Tori believed they had a solid alibi because they had those movie tickets, but after Cassie's body was discovered just a couple of days later, the police immediately went to Matt Beckham, her boyfriend, and started questioning him, and he immediately said, well, Brian and Tori were the only other two people that were with us that night. The police go to Brian and Tori, and under intense questioning, Brian and Tori would confess to what they had done. They were convicted and given life sentences without the opportunity for parole. Here is some of the video footage that was found on their camera.
We found our victim, and sad as it may be, she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices. Our first victim is going to be Cassie's daughter. She's going to be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get? We know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I locked the back doors, so it's all locked. Now we just gotta wait. I just killed Cassie. We just left her house. I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie.
So that's going to do it.